Good afternoon or morning to those on the West Coast. I am Ariana Campbell, shareholder and COO at Boomer Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is entitled Leading Change, Navigating Technology Transformation in Audit Firms. I'm joined today by Johnny Hubbs at Inflow, who I will introduce in just a moment. But before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items as well as some opening comments. So first of all, CPE credit. We will be offering CPE credit for today's webinar. And in order to receive CPE, you will need to participate in at least 3 polling questions and also complete the survey that will be sent out later today. Next, recording and materials. So today's webinar will be recorded and sent out to attendees this afternoon, along with any additional resources. Please utilize the closed caption feature in the Zoom menu below if needed. And then for Q&A, we will be happy to entertain questions from the audience today. But since your audio will remain muted, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Simply type your question into the Q&A box, and we will address those most relevant to the entire audience. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the conclusion of the webinar. So now that the housekeeping items are covered, I'd like to briefly offer up a few introductory thoughts on today's topic. Technology adoption is no longer optional for audit firms. But successful transformation is never just about choosing the right platform. It's about managing change across people, processes, and culture. So during this webinar, there aren't going to be any PowerPoint slides. It's going to be more of a podcast. We'll all be hosting a discussion with Johnny and drawing on her experience in helping firms navigate the challenges of digital transformation. And now, with keeping that in mind, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. So Johnny Hubbs is head of audit implementation services at Inflow, where she leads teams through successful adoption of Inflow's digital audit platform. With extensive experience from her previous role as senior manager at RSM US, Johnny brings deep audit experience and a passion for innovation. She guides firms in transforming their audit approach through cloud-based technology, data analytics, and modern methodologies. She's a licensed CPA and a certified fraud examiner, so that really gives her practical insight along with the ability to have collaborative leadership and commitment to audit quality. She regularly engages with industry leaders to drive meaningful change in the profession. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation. So welcome, Johnny.
Thank you, Ariana. Happy to be here today.
Yes, so we are, like I said, I mentioned to the audience, we're really going to be having just a dialogue and a conversation. But before we jump into our conversation, I want to go ahead and just get some feedback from the audience. So, audience members, using the chat function, I would love for you to use just one word to describe how your firm feels about change. You only get one word, but go ahead and use the chat and tell us, how does your firm feel about change? So let's see what answers we get back. One word that came in was overwhelmed. We also have an okay. I love the excited. We have one for excited, one for embrace. I like that word of embracing change. Open, that's a good first place to start. I'm liking the comments that are coming in here. You can feel free to keep those comments coming in, but it's great to get some perspective from the audience of kind of where they're sitting with change, because we know that change is necessary, but sometimes it can also be hard depending on what the change is. So, Johnny, I thought it was really interesting to look at some of the independent research that Inflow did. And some of the things that came out of that were that 70% of audit clients are considering switching firms within 3 years. 45% want auditors to make better use of technology. And then another data point was that 20% would switch purely due to outdated tools. So I would love to hear from you. Based on your experience, why does technology transformation feel so daunting for firms?
I think there's definitely a couple key areas here. One, and nobody will be surprised when I say this, time. There are not enough hours in the day at a CPA firm. I was an auditor for the first 16 years of my career, and so I remember what it was like staying on top of standards, serving clients, developing people, growing the business. And if you asked me on top of all of that to do this giant project, which was not really going to be counted towards my billable hours, and I wasn't going to have be relieved of my normal work and I have to do on top of that, I would have said, no, thank you. So, and the other thing I think that feeds into that is it's complacency a little bit. Firms have gotten comfortable with what they're using. They may not necessarily remember that it took them a ton of workarounds to get to this status quo. And they don't know what's out there because they're not really looking for it. It's just something that I think the market keeps talking about, this digital transformation that's coming in audit. And I think it's kind of like the revenue recognition standard. We all knew it was coming forever, and it just kind of became background noise. And I think all of the pressure for transformation feels that way now. And I like to give this example where anybody who knows me, this is where I don't practice what I preach. I'm not an adventurous eater at all. And so I have these things that I consider safe, and that's what I generally go with. But I've had a lot more international travel lately. And so I go over there to like the UK and I order things that I think are in my safe zone because they sound exactly like what I normally use or eat. And I try them and they're not what I was expecting. It's not great. And so I've been forced to branch out a bit more. And as a result, I've had some of the best meals of my life because I went outside of my comfort zone. And you'd think I would learn from that. But then I come back and I do the exact same thing at home. I'm like back to my little safe zone. So I understand why a big decision about changing our audit software, which is like the basis of everything we do in our practice at a CPA firm in an audit department, I can see why that's scary.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that analogy, but also how you took it in the direction of you've been able to have some of the best meals because getting outside of your comfort zone and trying something that you otherwise would not have exposed you to the unexpected in a positive way, but it shows how we have to be open to trying something different to even start in that direction. But along with that, your points about, why transformation feels so daunting, the not enough hours in the day. And, that is understandable, but continuing to think of how can we maybe position that a little bit differently, is a great point, but it's very, very real because it does feel like there are just competing priorities. And how do I take this on in addition to all the rest of the things that I'm doing? So that's such a valid point and in line with what we hear from clients as well. And complacency that you mentioned, because sometimes it's hard to even realize that you're being complacent because
Yep.
you're not looking at it from that perspective, especially if what you're doing right now, you're just familiar with it and it's kind of a little bit of autopilot and you've kind of tuned out some of the things that maybe aren't working well or the things that you've kind of started doing as workarounds, or you don't realize that it could be different if you tried something different. So I think those things of time and complacency are very real reasons for it feeling daunting, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. The complacency really resonates just because you you just don't know what's out there, and I think it's the pain of change. If you don't have that pain of change, you're not feeling enough pain internally, then there's no incentive to go looking for something, even though that could be holding you back.
Yeah. And when we think about, those two areas, those can definitely make change hard. But I'd love to hear from your experience. What just typically derails change projects is once people have made the decision to actually change, what typically derails them?
I would say not lack of preparation, not allowing enough time for a transition. You've done the evaluation. Choosing the new audit platform is the easy part. After that, like you said in the intro, now you've got to introduce it to the wider business, which introduces more opinions in the process, those who maybe didn't have a say in the initial evaluation. So you've got to balance that. you have to like get familiar. You have to learn the software. You have to figure out what your internal processes need to, if your internal processes need to change in order as a result of adopting a new platform. And this isn't where you want to be flying by the seat of your pants. So I think just having an idea, understanding your timeline of when you need to go live, working backwards in logical things, having a clear accountability across the business for people who will be helping in the process. So, and then, oh, did you want to?
I was just going to say that those are all really good points, the things that you outlined as far as the preparation point, really helping people to understand what's going to be happening so that they have a chance to process.
Yeah, exactly. And then I know I've watched some of your recent webinars with clients and they talk about the importance of being positive throughout that. So I agree with that. You definitely can't the implementation be derailed by negativity and resistance to change. But I think there's a flip side of that too, in that you can't practice toxic positivity. You can't like act like everything is sunshine and roses, that there are going to be no road bumps. I find that people will respect you more when you just own up to say, hey, listen, we did this thorough evaluation. We anticipate these are going to be the things that we're going to encounter that are going to cause the setbacks. We have a plan for dealing with this. We've considered this and we are going to support you through the transition. So I think that helps to kind of help people feel more confident that we thought this through and it wasn't just, we just made this decision on a Friday afternoon to change audit platforms.
100%. And I know when we are working with clients, we like to emphasize when it comes to a change initiative that 100% buy-in is a myth. And that's not how we measure our success. But our goal is to progressively get people on board and to really start with working with the willing, because then it doesn't have to be inauthentic positivity. Because typically, when it comes to a change or a technology implementation, you're going to have people that are excited to try it and to get on board. And that can start to build those success stories that are really positive to get those who are maybe more apprehensive along and kind of bring them on board when they can see what's happening and hear the success stories from their peers. So that's always something to think about too, is that again, 100% buy-in at the very beginning is a myth. And our goal is to focus on working with the willing and those who are excited and continue to educate and train and bring along those who maybe aren't as excited about it and really create those success stories that allow people to see that this is something that they want to be part of.
Yeah. And, I think for leadership too, we may not all we don't have 100% buy-in maybe as a leadership group, but we all have to have alignment that this is the decision we've made. So we can't have any subversiveness in going back and like, well, I didn't want to pick this, but they went that. So you gotta nip that in the bud too. And leadership has to be careful about keeping, if they have those opinions, keeping those to themselves. Sometimes you had your shot in the evaluation process and now this is what we've selected.
That's a really great point to highlight the difference between buy-in and alignment and the importance, especially at the leadership level, of continuing to model and communicate that there is alignment because this is the direction that we've decided to go in, even if not everyone is 100% bought in. Because again, it's going to be impossible with the different changes that firms are experiencing to expect everyone to be running forward, full of excitement. But that commitment from leadership to alignment and moving forward with the decision is important. And we don't have to not move forward just because there's not 100% buy-in. That's a really good distinction.
Right.
Well, let's go to our first polling question. So again, just want to make sure that you're answering all three questions in order to get your CPE credit. And our first question is, what is your firm's biggest challenge when implementing change? So you should see that CPE or that polling question has popped up. If you're not seeing it, it might be hidden behind another screen. So you just want to go ahead and identify that. We have some answers that are coming in. And as we're looking at these different challenges, there's a variety of things listed here, from resistance from staff, which could definitely be the case. We talked a little bit about, having leadership be aligned, lack of a clear process, which just leads to lack of understanding, or maybe you have a clear process, but you just haven't communicated it yet. And then the one of you're just not sure. So a lot of good answers here, but the one that is kind of risen to the top is leadership misalignment. So about half of the responses were centered around leadership misalignment. And then second place being resistance from staff. So Johnny, as you're seeing that, what's coming to mind for you?
It's interesting. I didn't expect the leadership misalignment to be leading, and I don't know if that's because we have a higher incidence of leaders watching, or we have a higher incidence of staff leading, and there's a little bit of cross. I find that interesting, but not necessarily surprising when I think about it.
Yeah. And it's great
As-
to have kind of the real time feedback from the group to see what they're thinking. So that as we're discussing things, if you are experiencing that leadership misalignment or feeling some resistance from staff, for the audience to start thinking about how might they be able to address that. So good stuff. Well, let's move into our next section. So we talked a little bit about why change is necessary, but it can also be hard. So I'd love to talk a little bit next about just building buy-in across the firm. So I have a couple of things that I just want to pick your brain about, want to have you share your experience with the audience about a couple of things. So first of all, where do you really start when helping firms secure buy-in? So when you're working with firms, what have you seen as a good place to start? And I think along with that, we know that you have to have a compelling why that's really resonating with both leadership and staff, kind of going back to these poll responses that we just saw. Those are two
Mhm.
critical parts of building buy-in. And the third, it's a multi-part question, but the third part that I'd say is
Of
what
course it is.
strategies really engage audit teams early when they're fearing disruption. So all related things, but securing buy-in, creating a compelling why, and addressing fears of disruption.
Sure. So those are a lot, that's a lot of topics. So I know this is supposed to be about implementation, but I want to highlight that I think the importance of building buy-in really does come from it starts when you're evaluating a platform. Like that decision to change audit methodologies is the point where you need to start kind of building that buy-in, explaining the why you are looking for something else. And when I don't want to rehash again all of your other excellent webinars with people who've gone through the change, but I do think it's important to get feedback from those multiple levels, from those who will be in the platform day to day doing their job, the ones who will be reviewing in it, and then the ones who will just be touching it, for high level review as well. Because when they have a say and they really like it, then they become very enthusiastic, and that enthusiasm is contagious, like you said right before this section. So getting that input is really important. And then all of my sales and marketing team, if they're watching, they're going to hate me that I'm saying this, but the other thing is that it's really important, and I think firms neglect to do a thorough evaluation of the software. Don't listen to the hype about any platform. There is no perfect platform. And the perfect platform is the one that meets the needs that you have. So before you go into that process, you should be like, what are the things where are our pain points? Does this address it? And again, because there is no perfect solution, there are probably going to be some things on your list that none of the current platforms meet. And that's fine. As long as you know that going in, you have a feeling of, where the vendor is going on this. And that kind of feeds back into the toxic positivity thing. You need to be proactive about any of those areas that may be, you may cover some of your current pain points. You may introduce a few new pain points that you didn't have because it's a transition. So being proactive, having a plan for that, being transparent about it in those communications, acknowledge anything that you think could be a speed bump and instill confidence that you considered it carefully, knowing that it is a speed bump. You have a plan, again, and we'll work through it together. Those contagious, that enthusiasm that's contagious, those people naturally become your champions and the cheerleaders, and then hopefully they can recruit some others to the cause.
No, that's all really good ways of thinking about how you can build buy-in. And again, thinking about how the buy-in needs to be happening across the firm, not just having pockets of people who are bought in, but again, how can we truly have that buy-in and that excitement that actually translates to changed behaviors, like in doing things differently, using different platforms, different technologies, things in different ways in a way that really sticks. And I think that the things that you highlighted definitely speak to that. And I know that we've talked in the past about kind of the three key areas that you highlighted there of leadership alignment, creating the firm champions, and having the transparent communication. Can you speak a little bit more to the communication part from your perspective? And as you're going through a change like this, what are some things that you've seen there?
So throughout so first of all, again, introducing it to the wider business. Here's why we decided it was time to switch. Here's what we were looking for. Here's why we selected this option, etc. Further on in the process, it becomes like, here are the things that we are doing to help with transition. And so having that open, having a space for people to ask questions when they have questions as you go through the transition process. And I think we may touch on this a little bit later too, but having communication of your firm policies that are changing, a consistent support system, I believe. So open communication, places for people to ask questions, proactive communications about next steps, timelines, what people can expect, the help that is available.
Those are all really good things that need to be included in the communication plan. And was actually talking to a group of firms about in our operations circle about change and some of the different elements that help to support the people through change. And we had a discussion about helping people to understand what's going to be changing specifically for their role and what they're doing. So, looking at the different roles that are going to be using that technology and saying specifically, this is what it means for you in your role. Because oftentimes firms will explain it as the firm as a whole or what it's going to do for the clients, but they don't speak as much to the individual, which can really help with buy-in when people understand not only for their own role, but for the roles that they interact with, what impact the tool is going to be having. And so some of the best practices around that become having a discussion and having both verbal and then follow up materials and information so that people can really see that, because that gets to be exciting as well. Like if I get to use it for this, that's really cool, but then this person who's either upstream or downstream or cross stream from me is going to see
Yeah.
these benefits too, and it's like I had no idea.
Yeah. I facilitate some industry groups at Inflow with different leaders who are in various stages of implementation, and just, they come and share their best practices and the things that they've done that have really worked for them. And like, oh, we did get to this first, and maybe we now knowing what we know, we wouldn't do this. And so it's nice to have just that two-way communication. Some of those groups run themselves. I just sit back and listen to them talk, and then sometimes actually ask them questions.
Yeah, and then it's fun to even ask as you're getting into the implementation again with wanting to continue to build that buy-in and get people on board. Again, that's a great time to ask, like specifically for your role, what are you really excited about or what's working well for you? Tell me a little bit about that before and after. Because again, building those and creating those success stories is really what helps with lasting buy-in.
Yeah.
So I want to keep going in our conversation here and kind of talk a little bit about how you structure the implementation for success. So, really thinking about what are things that people should be considering as they're going into implementation. So, I know that implementing new technology can get messy without structure. But what separates successful rollouts from those that struggle?
Yeah. So I think, again, lack of time, not allocate, or lack of a plan, not allocating enough resources, and biting off more than you can chew are kind of like the broad categories. I know, as hard as it may be, dedicate resources to the transition. Like, don't just pile this project on top of your best performer and then have them keep their full normal workload if you can help it. Hopefully you don't have to, voluntold too many people to get involved. Hopefully there is some excitement there. I think the other thing is consider a phased approach. So we do have like a process that we walk firms through, and I've already beat the evaluation piece to death. So now we're into the planning and onboarding. But when we think about a phased approach, it could mean a couple different things. It could be that you start with some of your audits to get a feel for the platform. It could be that you maybe timing wise, you have to convert all of your audits, but maybe you don't use every bell and whistle of the platform first. Maybe you get the basics down, what you have to do to issue a good quality compliant audit, and then you can focus on adding those extra features in the next year. Change overload is a thing. So it's a lot. We think about changing a platform. It's not just changing the technology. Most of the platforms have a methodology built into it. And there may be differences between that methodology and your old methodology. So there's some thought to consider, like, are we adopting 100%? Are we, doing a hybrid approach? And that takes some time to think through. I think the other thing related to that would be I really recommend pilot engagements. So you don't have to do a live engagement. You can recreate a prior year. And that's where you do the planning, do risk assessment, think about the significant risk areas and completion, and really understand how the platform is intended to work before you go in thinking about, okay, now I have to layer on my stuff on top of this. What changes do I want to make? What do I potentially want to customize? And again, thinking about my processes, what maybe needs to tweak, because the firms that struggle are the ones that say, I used to do this exactly like this in my old software, and I want to do it exactly like this in the new software. They're not the same thing. I always say in training, it's kind of like Hulu and Netflix. At the end of the day, you can get to what you want to stream, but the buttons that you push and the menus you go through are going to be different to get there. And so same with audit platforms, they're different. I would definitely recommend, if you can have each industry do their own pilots, that's helpful. And then the other thing that people want to do, they want to pick their most complicated clients to start with for a pilot. And if it can handle this, it can handle everything else. But you don't even really know the software at that point. So like maybe start with some of your basic clients, get that basics, build that foundation, and then you'll be better able to understand what that requires for those really significant complex clients.
Those are all really good things to keep in mind. And I think especially, where you started out with is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think so many times it can feel like if we're going to try something new, to your point, we have to see everything that it can do. It's like we have this new car, we need to take it out on the highway and just open it up and see what this car can do. But really, you learn a lot from the phased approaches, from the pilots, from being able to see and get an understanding of how it works at the most basic functionality. That doesn't mean that you can't add on extra complexity, but it can really help to take that phased approach. And I would just also encourage people to not think of it as all or nothing, because oftentimes that slows down progress. And I think that's where the continuous improvement mindset really comes along with. We are not trying to have everything work perfectly. We are really trying to focus on making progress and seeing what works and then continuing to build on that, because that also allows you to, again, build those success stories while not overwhelming people, realizing that this is progressive. I think that people often feel more comfortable when they don't have to change everything overnight. So it allows you to really support the individuals as well as you're going through the change.
Yeah. I used to work with an audit partner, and he would always say that a mediocre decision made in time was better than a perfect decision made too late. And so I kind of feel like that ties in here as well.
I love that saying.
I
And
know.
another one that stuck out to me with what you said was the role that process plays in this. And I liked your Hulu and Netflix example, but I think it's really important to emphasize that we can't just take old processes and put them into new technology. Heck, we probably shouldn't even just be putting old processes into our existing technology, but it's even more important to do a process review when through the lens of where we're going and what we want things to look like. I mean, we always want to learn from the things of the past because obviously that's what's made, the firm successful.
Mhm.
But what are old habits that we need to leave behind? What's not adding value internally or to the client? What processes are just outdated and we don't need them anymore? Where would we say this is how we've always done it? Because what you don't want to do is try and take those old processes and just kind of mash them into new technology. And I think that that can get back to some of those pieces that we talked about that are a little bit daunting. Firms are like, I don't have time to do a process review. That's going to take a lot of resources. But I always say, what happens if you don't?
Right,
What happens if
right.
you don't do those things?
Well, and there's two points related to that. What happens if you don't? One is if you are going to go the pilot approach, I recommend getting training for your pilot users because you don't want them to struggle through the pilot while they're trying to figure stuff out because it doesn't set them off on the right foot thinking when they have to struggle. When if we did some sort of basic training just to get the basics down, they would feel a lot more confident going through it. So I know sometimes there are cost considerations or we just can't get everybody available. We only want to do one training closer to roll out, but I would highly encourage training of pilot users if you're using pilots to kind of practice. And then as you finish your pilots, that's when you need to like get the feedback from them and regroup for what our rollout plan will be. What are the areas that cause confusion? Where do our processes need to change? We talked about, are there areas in the software it would be beneficial to have firm guidance available for people at rollout? Or is there a template that we would like to use because maybe the software allows for templates to be used in there. So um, the other part of that is that's what the pilot process is for, is kind of answering all of those questions because that's when you're still figuring it out. But when you have the ability to, nail down a lot of that prior to rollout training, then that becomes that consistent messaging. We've thought this through. And so when we train, I really like it when I train and I have a person from the firm who's been responsible for this process with me, even like standing up there with me presenting or virtually chiming in. So I talk about the functionality and they say, and this is how we're going to do it here. And I think that because otherwise, if that person's not there or they haven't thought of it, I've been in trainings where somebody's asked that question, well, have we thought about how we're going to do this? And then it just spirals and we're way now on a tangent because we're trying to figure out a process question. And I'm just trying to get back to like, let's talk about the functionality here. So I can't really help you with your process specific procedure on that. So
No, that's a really good point. And being able to connect between the two is connect the dots between in some case, for many people at that point, it's theory and reality. It makes it real for them. And that helps with buy-in too. And it helps to instill confidence when they can see that things about the process are going to have already been thought about. And of course, you're not going to have every single detail
no,
figured out, but to your point, when there's that forethought given, it can really make a difference. And it's worth investing the time, in doing that. When we think about implementation, it doesn't start when we flip the switch, obviously.
right.
Buy-in starts months and months, depending on the scope of the project, beforehand. And so much of change and buy-in and supporting the individual comes with understanding the emotions that they're experiencing. And if
Mhm.
they feel unsure, if they feel confused, if they feel a lack of clarity, for all of us, not just everyone else, for all of us as humans, we tend to like our radar goes up, right? And we're like,
Yep.
ooh, something's feeling off to me. Something doesn't feel good here. And no matter, how much we may want to support something, if those type of things are kind of giving us red flags, it can make us feel more resistant to change. And so I think the things that you've outlined there are really important and things for people to keep in mind, that it's not just about, again, having the implementation plan. That's an important part. but what are the things that are being done to support the individual? And that comes in connecting some of those dots for people proactively so that they're not having to figure it out on their own. I'd much rather have you tell me how those pieces connect as opposed to me going, how does
Yeah.
that work? Let me think through
Yeah.
this.
And I don't want to stereotype accountants, but I would think that the majority of us are type A and we like to have control and know what we're doing, and that's where we find a lot of comfort. And so that period of being unsure and uncertain, like you said, really does cause a lot of stress.
Yes, I like to
So
think about it as being really detail oriented and being able to ensure that things are sound and that they've been thought through, applying, that logic and problem solving and pieces like that, along with, maybe, who knows, maybe some of the people have the control thing going too. But
yes.
I think the more clarity we can create, the more that we can build more buy-in. So, is there anything else that you would say to the group when it comes to structuring the implementation for success? Are there any other things that you would call out?
Yeah, I think I've done trainings where I've known what system the people were switching from, and obviously I know what they're switching to if I'm doing the training. I think being able to draw the parallels between this is where you would have documented it here in your old system, this is where you can document it here. So providing a crosswalk, because we may know some of the prior systems at Inflow, but we don't know them all in detail. So that's where we rely on you guys to help, or not you, Boomer, but the clients to help to say, help draw that parallel for people so that they understand, okay, yeah, this is the format is changing and what we're doing might change, but this is essentially these are how these correlate. And then also combating that unsure piece of it would be having a central communication hub to disseminate questions, to accumulate or disseminate information, accumulate questions, having visibility into all the questions that are being asked helps you identify early themes like, okay, wait, no, this is clearly something that's taking on a life of its own now, we need to get ahead of this, or maybe we didn't do a great job in training on this because there are a lot of subsequent struggles with this particular form or this particular piece of methodology. And so having that, and then last few things, I don't want to take too much time for this area, but I would don't just consider implementation, consider long-term, because after you get up and running, somebody still needs to be accountable for staying up to date on the platform and what functionality changes there are, what content updates there are, when do we need to apply those, and making sure that everybody's aware of them so that you get all of the right things in your file or do all of the right things and don't have frustrations. And then, throughout this, you should feel supported by your vendor. So you should feel like you can talk to your customer success person or your audit implementation person. They should be supporting you through the process and helping you if you're running into issues. We have a lot of experience with clients. Now, I will admit I have experience with this, but I still continually learn really good pieces of information from my clients. So, but there's no reason I can't take something I learned from another client and help you out with it by passing it along. So I think you should feel supported by the people that you're working with.
100%. It should be a partnership. It's a big undertaking, to make a change like this. And the more that it can be a partnership, the more confident the people in the firm are going to be who are, on the front lines with the implementation. And then they can help the rest of the firm feel more confident as well. And so I agree with that part about really leaning on the your implementation person or your customer success manager, because there are a lot of ups and downs when it comes to going through an implementation.
Mhm.
There are times where it's because you have to figure out just how to do something new, or it can just be a hiccup that comes along. That's part of the implementation process. But I'd say that building that relationship and looking at it as a partnership also builds trust. And we know that when there's a high level of trust, that we're able to move at a faster pace, for sure.
Yep.
So, all very good things. Let's get ready and go to our second poll question. So, you will see that second polling question pop up. You should have it there and available. And our polling question is, when it comes to technology implementation, which area needs the most improvement in your firm? So we have a number of different items that you can choose from, but you only get to pick one. So we have our planning and rollout strategy, user adoption and training. We also have change communication, internal ownership and accountability. And then we have a none of the above. So as we're seeing those answers come in, I'll give everyone just another about 5 seconds before we close the poll. But right now, internal ownership and accountability is in the lead. So as we get ready and close out the poll, Johnny, what are your thoughts about the internal ownership and accountability being the top answer there?
That one, not surprising at all, just considering all of the things we've just talked about, time, and some of the people who have to be involved in some of the higher level decisions are naturally busier people. And our day job doesn't stop for us to implement new technology. It'd be nice if we could just pause and be like, clients will be back with you in about 3 months. We're going to do an internal project. So, just hold on, but that doesn't happen. So not surprised. I wish the accountability wasn't the problem, but yeah, not surprised.
Yeah, and it's hard because oftentimes when people hear the word accountability, it can be a negative connotation.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be, right? When we think about accountability, it's really how can we just ensure that we're being successful together for the long term? That's the way that I think of it, that we're all committed to the success of this implementation and ultimately to each other's success, the firm's success, the client's success. And I think that when we can look at accountability through that lens instead of people getting in trouble, because I still think that that's the way that it's seen a lot of the time, but it's like, how can we all be accountable to each other to making sure that this is a success? And I think that the more transparent we can be around the things around communication that you mentioned earlier, I think also helping people to understand what are not only the key performance indicators or the outcomes that we want to see happen and being clear on those, but also helping them to understand what behaviors need to change because sometimes people just don't know what they're being held accountable to. And then having conversations, especially when it comes to a technology implementation, of how can we make things more visible so that people can see how they're doing, because sometimes it's just that people thought they were killing it, but it actually wasn't translating the way that you had hoped to get those desired outcomes. So I think the visibility through dashboards and information can be really valuable too.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
So thank you to all who responded to that poll. I want to go ahead and move us on to hearing about some lessons from the field. So I would love to hear you share an example of a firm that got the implementation right and to tell us a little bit about what worked. But I would also want to hear an example of a firm that struggled and what were the warning signs that were missed? Because typically, when a firm struggles, there are some warning signs along the way. So, share a story of what worked and also
Yeah.
one where there was some struggle.
So I know some of the examples that I'm going to give are from a firm that's listening out there today, but so some and obviously I'm going to repeat some of the things that we've already talked about, but these are things that people did their implementations went pretty well. So one I've already mentioned is I've had two. One had firm training right after the functionality training. So like I spent the first day with them going over the functionality of the software, and then they had a second day to say, okay, now let's really drive home our firm policies and our methodology choices and how that layers into it. And then I've also, like I said, taught side by side where it was layered in as we were talking about a specific form or a specific piece of functionality. And I found that to be really effective for the users because they got their question answered and then they could continue their focus rather than spiraling in their head about, I don't know how we're going to do that. Like, and then they're no longer paying attention to me. They're worried about what that means for them and their audit. I mentioned that I hoped you could do pilots for industries. So other firms that have been successful have done industry training and provided industry guides after the inflow training. So they would take, like their FI practice would get together and they would say, what are specific FI policies that we need to layer on? And then we created a handbook for our people. So like, hey, here's some things for materiality that we consider, almost like an audit manual, but specific to an industry. Here are the things that are specific to our industry and how we want to address them in the software. And then weekly office hours, I mentioned that as a place for users to ask questions. It doesn't necessarily need to be mandatory, but I think even if you don't have a question, encouraging people to attend is helpful because they'll hear stuff maybe they haven't gotten to that point, and they'll hear a tip that will help them when they get there. And then you could further segregate those to where it's managers and partners in one, and then staff and seniors in another, because generally kind of the things they're running up against are slightly different, and maybe don't need to listen to either. You could join that. And then I had one client, which is actually in a previous role, but she created a newsletter with a funny name that kind of worked in the name of the software. And she sent out a weekly newsletter on tips and tricks. So one was like setting up quarterly files and how somebody would do that. And it was like all the instructions. And so it's just bits and pieces filtered out throughout the implementation period on the stuff where they thought people might struggle. And the name cracked me up at the time because it was a good way to pull in the name of the software and then what the point of the newsletter was.
I love that. And I
Yeah.
think the point, especially for the newsletter, about having that regular communication in a fun and engaging way, because people are learning things as they're going through this implementation, and sharing them and having a channel for sharing them is a really important thing to think about beforehand so that you can have them placed. So from the very beginning, when people are seeing these tips and tricks, they can start sharing them with other people. And then it gets back to the success stories and getting people on board as they're seeing that maybe something they thought was really complicated. Oh, here's a tip and trick for that. So
Yep.
I love that newsletter example, and the office hours. Again, I love your point that it's not mandatory, but having a place, it's about having a channel for people to ask questions instead of them just sitting like they're feeling like they're sitting and kind of spinning their wheels is really valuable, as well as the industry groups and the policy training. So those are all really great examples of things that have worked well. What would you say are some red flags that might indicate some struggles?
Yeah. Before I did think of one more, and I do think it's important. So I do want to go back to just really quickly is we talked about a plan, best laid plans. Sometimes things happen. So I think being able to pivot when you need to is important. And I know I talked about the champions, like hopefully you don't have to voluntold very many of them, but there have been trainings where I've asked a question or other people have asked a question and somebody else in the training has answered it before I can even answer it. And I've asked like, are you a champion? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, now you are. And so I think it's not always your best performers that make good champions for these. So kind of have that in mind too, that it could surprise you who really gets into kind of learning this process.
That's a great point. And to also realize that it could be any length of tenure that
Yeah.
might, be really engaged in it as well. I think it's easy to make stereotypes to either side of it, that maybe you need more experience in order to participate, or maybe younger people are, more prone to want to use technology. And I think definitely really throwing those stereotypes out the window and being in tune, like you said, to who's engaged and who's participating can really help you put together the most effective cross-functional team. It's a great
Yeah,
point.
the use of technology is really big because I've just been shocked at what some of our clients have done to help in the conversion process, and I would have never thought of that. And that's my job to think of that. So it's been great for the
So what
red
about those red
flags.
flags?
Oh yeah, um, one red flag for me that I see is they don't want to do training. They expect their users to do self study and or watch videos, and they think that that's enough. That's a red flag for me. Um, Not doing a thorough evaluation, like, hey, I saw a demo, I want to buy this and we need to implement in 2 weeks. Like, no, you're setting yourself up for failure, but I know you're going to think it's me setting you up for failure. So the rushing to implement, uh, I talked about this briefly, didn't want to provide pilot users training. So they struggled to work through the pilot and then they would ask a ton of questions. And I'm like, oh man, I could have saved you hours of work if you'd have asked me one question like 4 weeks ago. So I think that's important. And then the attitude thing. I know that there have been certain examples recently where firms have had to change, and maybe it was an unexpected or forced change to pick software, and going into it with like not viewing that as an opportunity and trying to turn that around and just presenting it. I've had a leader introduce me to the training, like, well, we're here because we had to change, and she's going to tell us about the software. And I'm like, well, thank you for that. That really gets people excited. So again, I do warn against toxic positivity, but you got to give me a little bit of positivity.
Well, and I think that gets back to the why that we
Yeah,
talked about earlier, because there has to be a why beyond, even in those situations where
right.
maybe it was more circumstantial, there is still definitely a why that's going to come with the opportunity of using a new software, and even just the evaluation that's going to happen along with that of, we're going to be
Yep.
evaluating our processes. We're going to be asking different questions about how people are working and how they're getting things done and what's valuable to them. So I think that you're right. Attitude and mindset has so much to do with it, because if people just feel like the change is happening to them because it has to, and if that's kind of the tone from the top, then it is going
Mhm.
to be really hard to get excited about it in light of all the things that you talked about at the beginning, with the not really having a lot of time to make change. Well, I thought what we were doing was working just fine. So it is important from the very beginning to think about the messaging, and even just beyond the messaging, like, what do you genuinely feel are the benefits about this? And I think most times, then when we sit down and spend just a couple of minutes thinking about it, even if it's due to circumstances, there can be a lot to uncover that you can then use to really encourage the team.
Mhm. Right.
So, in the last couple of minutes that we have left, I think it's an interesting way. It's interesting to think about the internal benefits when it comes to, making a change like this. But there's also the client impact and how switching to this platform can really help to benefit the client. So I thought that the inflow research also had a couple of interesting things on client expectations. So 87% of clients want more flexibility in audit services, and 30% of clients would pay up to 20% more for audits that deliver more value. So, when it comes to how we're even thinking about this through a different lens, I think something that we have to make sure we at least touch on is the value aspect of this. So, from your perspective, how can firms use these client demands or client opportunities to build more momentum internally?
I might flip that on its head and say, like we felt like we were switching to the software and there are a lot of benefits. And clearly we considered the client as a part of that because a lot of the platforms now have modules for interacting with clients. And so we've had to give that some evaluation. I don't know how many clients have said my clients will say that their clients won't use this. They're not going to be open to this. Have you even asked them? Because when I have used other products in the past, that have made in communication easier with my client, not one single client balked on it. So I've been in your shoes. I've had clients where I thought, this might not go well. And they've all pretty much agreed that it was. So I think we're letting our own fears get in the way of thinking about the benefits it would offer to the client and just thinking about reframing some of the benefits you're getting out of it. Like, gosh, this is all in one place and I can just pull it into the software. Well, all in one place is good for your client too. They don't like receiving 12 emails from, four different staff people and then a different open items list at the end of the day that recaps it because then it's hard to figure out where everything is. So I think kind of reframing some of the benefits you're getting and looking at the benefits that your client can get is a second way to be excited about it. And then when your clients don't push back maybe as much, there is always going to be one, but maybe that's something to make us challenge our way of thinking as well.
No, that's a great point. And I know that when we work on process improvement engagements, or sometimes even when we get into things around strategic planning, there is a fear that the clients are going to have a negative reaction. But when you think about how our clients are using technology in their everyday life, it's not foreign to them, right? There are so many different other aspects of just their day to day, when they're on their phone, taking care of business, where they're doing those things using, platforms that are intuitive, that allow them to get everything in one place, that are delivering value and insights. And so for us to think about it through the lens of how they're operating on their day to day, and then maybe first of all, ask ourselves again, do we really think that they wouldn't find this valuable? And then from there, to ask the clients, would you find this valuable? And for it coming from a place where we're open to their response of yes, because
Yeah.
I agree, sometimes there's some fear that if our clients say yes, that now we're going to have to deliver, something that's all or nothing right now with these limited time constraints. But taking many of the things that you've highlighted during this, remembering, the phased approach, the pilots, the different things that you can do internally to support the change, can really help to not only increase the value that's happening within the firm, but also for the clients as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I'm going to take us to our last polling question. So our last polling question is, who typically leads major change efforts in your firm? So we have a variety of different roles listed here, from managing partner to our technology lead to department heads. Maybe you have a cross-functional team. And we also have an option for a no formal leader. I think that this can definitely vary across firms, and sometimes even by initiative. But as these responses are coming in, it's going to be interesting to see where most respondents are sitting with this. So we'll give you about another 10 seconds to respond to the polling question. Again, if you don't see it, it might be hidden behind another window. So just go ahead and locate that polling question. But as we're waiting for the last couple of answers, I do see that cross-functional team is what is coming to the top right now. So we'll give it 5 more seconds. We'll close the poll and see what our final answers are. Okay, so cross-functional team did stay in the lead, but there's also, we have these answers of managing partner, department heads, or having no formal leaders. So as you're looking at this, Johnny, what are you thinking?
I'm glad cross-functional team is in the lead just because I think oftentimes we do need that input from different areas. I'm choosing to interpret it loosely as in potentially cross-functional within the department as well. Or even it varies because they recognize that it does need to vary between projects, like you said. So I'm gonna take this as positive.
Yes, I agree. I also think that it's good to see the cross-functional team rising to the top. And, just to keep in mind that when we think about leading major change efforts, that it is important to make sure that there is leadership. And as we talked about, that there's alignment, and that those people who are leading the change are thinking about the things that have been mentioned in today's webinar. So, with that, it's been great having this conversation with you, Johnny. And just thanks again to Inflow for sponsoring today's webinar. It was great to talk through your insights specifically around a bunch of different things. We were able to cover a lot of different areas. So, we talked about why firms can't afford to delay technology transformation, how to secure buy-in from leadership teams and clients. I'm glad we also got to cover some practical strategies for structuring a smoother, more successful implementation. And I really enjoyed hearing your insights on lessons learned from firms who got it right as well as those red flags that really indicate the chance that there might be some struggles, and then how shifting client expectations are accelerating the pace of change. So it was great having conversations around all of those things. I know a key takeaway for me is definitely that change succeeds when people, process, and platform align. And the perspectives that you've shared during our time together have really helped to highlight that. So as follow up for the attendees, please keep an eye out for the recording, as well as some resources around Inflow's proven process in that independent research report that I referenced during the webinar. Johnny, thank you so much for sharing your insights with the audience today. And
Yes,
thank
thank
you to
you.
everyone out there for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on a future Boomer Consulting webinar.
Bye.